Hello and welcome to the Cuyamaga Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, and along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach. And on behalf of our Board of Directors, our advisors, volunteers, and supporting members, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Cuyamaga Institute is an independent, nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness and the human experience, following the footsteps of our founder, anthropologist, Dr. Felicitas Goodman. And our focus is reflected in three main areas: experience, education, and exploration. We respect the path of academic balance, the creative pursuit of science, while advancing, conserving, and restoring a direct experience of the deeper human connection to all of life. And it is part of our mission to expand our own experiential research with the multidisciplinary understanding that's available to us today. So, as an educational institution, we take an open approach and we invite scholars in related fields to help broaden the scope of our own work and exploration. And that's why we call this Conversation for Exploration. And on these weekly Sunday discussions, full spectrum of topics: neuroscience, anthropology, archaeology, archaeoastronomy, eco-spirituality, philosophy, psychology, mythology, shamanism, rituals, the hero's journey. It goes on and on and on, from the arts to the sciences and so much more. We have a couple hundred presentations on our website, a webcast, and also a podcast. And you're welcome to visit our website at cuyamagainstitute.com. All of these presentations are free. And as a nonprofit, we invite you to become a supporting member. And we want to thank you, the community members who continue to support the mission of the Cuyamaga Institute.
Hey, it's a big universe out there, and we like to go exploring.
Exactly. Well, how about today? Today, we challenge that popular theory that the first humans arrived in the Americas, 12 or 14,000 years ago, crossing that Bering land bridge from Siberia to Alaska. There's more and more evidence from genetics, linguistics, geology, archaeology, revealing a far longer and more complex history of the first humans of the Americas. And what if this evidence pushes us back, way back, maybe more than 100,000 years? This will fundamentally change how we think about human history. And many Indigenous people have been telling us the whole time that they've been here since time immemorial. Maybe it's time we listen.
Well, while it's being widely acknowledged that there are multiple migrations, the next question is, how far back were the first migrations? And I know in our radio career, we were interviewing several archaeologists at that time that were finding some of the highly controversial sites in the Americas due to their age. Those are now acknowledged. And we picked up this story again here in talking with James Harrod, a longtime Cuyamaga Institute teacher and researcher into Paleolithic art. And James introduced us to the archaeologist Mike Gramley on his work with mammoth and mastodon artifacts in the States. Yeah. And Gramley led us to Leon Sam Briggs, a Seneca elder, who's worked with mammoth and recreating artifacts, and to Yuri Chachula, an archaeologist and geologist who recounted how the land bridge was passable 20 and 30,000 years ago, and to Tyler Chase, filmmaker, who's busy documenting this story in her upcoming film, and then to our guest today. So this is not a lone voice, our guest today. That's my point. But she is a voice that we truly want to include in this unraveling, a voice really at the center of this story, the descendants of the people that we are tracing. The Indigenous archaeologist, Dr. Paulette Steeves, is our guest today. She is Cree-Metis. She is the Canadian Research Chair in the Healing and Reconciliation Department at Algoma University in Ontario. Yeah. Her book is The Indigenous Paleolithic of the Western Hemisphere. This is on the Pleistocene's hidden human history of the Americas, and the accumulation of evidence wider than you would suspect to reclaim this much longer history of the first peoples here in the Americas. So welcome, Paulette. It is such a joy to have you here. And
thank you.
You say that your book has another purpose, to set a path for healing. And you say that you're the only one of the few Indigenous archaeologists out there that are focusing on the early habitation sites older than 10,000 years. What led you to this? You're going to tell us in your slideshow. And
Yeah,
why a path to healing? Why is this important to you?
well, all Native American, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, none of them are untouched by colonization. We're healing from 500 years of genocide that in many areas, for a lot of people are still facing a lot of violence, a lot of social political disparities. They're trying to reclaim their languages, their lifeways, their sovereignty, their lands, and by the way, their history that was erased and denied by Eurocentric archaeologists working as handmaidens to the nation state. All of these are pieces of healing. It's important for all people to understand history. Everywhere in the world, every group of people there are very proud of their connections to their homelands and to their ancestors. But we don't get that in the Americas without a lot of pain and a lot of fighting. And it's really a human rights abuse for archaeologists to continue to deny us our links to our homelands and our ancestors in deep time. So it is a big piece of healing.
How has your book been received?
Wow, I was really floored. Like I say, I wrote the book for Indigenous communities to start to create a path to healing, one of our ways of reclaiming. But it seems that a lot of people, settler people and Indigenous people, have been waiting for a book like this for a long, long time. So I've received many, many emails from faculty that are using it as a textbook. And I've received emails from people who said, their parents were in tears because they knew the story wasn't right. These are settler people that came to Canada and respected the Indigenous people. And it really bothered them to see what they assumed was their deep history denied. And so, the book is really caught on. And that's great, because how do we share education beyond doing podcasts and documentaries? Well, it's in the book.
Yeah.
And so the more people that can share the book with their communities, with Indigenous communities, with libraries, the more people become educated. And the more people become educated, the more we push back on misinformation, racism, and discrimination. So I have done the research to show that when people become more informed about Indigenous peoples' deep history in the Americas, it does change their worldview of those people. So it does push back on racism.
You have a slideshow, and what are we going to see in the slideshow?
Well, let me share my screen and get started.
All right.
So just give me a second.
This is even more impactful with the visuals. Yeah.
Okay. So I am Tansi, and thank you all for being here today. I am Cree-Metis. All the research that I do is research that is done in ceremony with relationality, respect, relevance, and reciprocity. Mm-hmm. Research that is framed in Indigenous method and theory based on respect, relationality, reciprocity is a praxis that weaves through institutional and public spaces to create social change. So my place in being a part of this ceremony of research and in telling this story was told to me within a discussion I had with a Salish elder, Leonard Sampson, in Lillooet, British Columbia, where I grew up in 1988. I was going through a very difficult time. I was getting divorced. I had 3 children, no money, a grade 8 education, 26 cents, and a truck. But I went to the elder to ask for his input. And he said, what you're going through right now is really hard, but it's training, because he said that the elders had watched me grow up, even though I didn't live on the reservation. They had watched me grow up. It was a small area. They knew my family well, and they said they knew that I had a really important job to do. They didn't know what that job was or what it would entail, but they knew that it would be really helpful to all the Indian people he said, not just in our community, everywhere in the Americas. And he said, you know, what you're going through now is really hard. And he said, I hate to tell you, but down the road, it's going to be a lot harder. But this is work that is really going to be very important to our people. You know, and at the time, like I said, I was a single parent. I had a great education, a truck, 3 kids, 26 cents. I had no clue what I would do. But when I was graduating with my PhD in 2015, his words were ringing through my ears all day long. Oh, this is the job I was given to do. I just have to rewrite world history to include the Americas. No problem. I got this. So that's how, you know, it came to me what I was given to do. So, you know, in an Indigenous methodology, stories do the work of colonization. When I first talked to the publisher about my book and said, you know, I'm Cree-Metis, I'm First Nation, I will write this as a story. He said, well, academic books aren't written as stories. I said, well, I need to write it not just for the academics, but for the people mostly. He said, well, you can't write academic books for the people. And I said, just watch me.
Yay.
And so now we have a very successful book that anybody can read that's accessible. So I'm very happy that it worked out. But Aman Siam and Eric Ritzkes argue that stories are decolonization theory in its most natural form. They are resurgent moments which reclaim epistemic ground that was erased by colonization. In processes of resistance, resurgence, and reclamation, stories lay the foundational framework for Indigenous sovereignty and the reclamation of material ground. So, Western archaeologists created fictional stories about the Indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. And really, I feel very grateful to those archaeologists that actually published on older than Clovis sites, because they put their careers at risk and they faced a lot of overly severe critique of their work, which, as you all can well imagine, there's nothing scientific about that, right? That's pure racism and pure hate. And it's very evident in the written history of American archaeology, how they denied initially that Indigenous people were only here 3,000 years. That was Alex Herlishka's story. But then in, you know, the 1920s, Jesse Figgins from the Denver Museum uncovered artifacts in New Mexico that were in the ribs of an extinct bison that was at least 10,000 years old. So that's where you get the name, the Clovis people, and the Clovis tool is from the area of Clovis, New Mexico, where this site was found. However, Clovis were not a people. They were not first. They were a Western creation of a fictional cultural group. Nowhere in the world is there a cultural group that's as big as a continent. Cultural groups are small. So these are some of the very simple questions that for over 100 years, archaeologists ignored, right? What the Clovis people did was erase the diversity of the Indigenous people in the Americas. So the only place the so-called Clovis people ever existed was in the wildest imagination of the archaeological mind. Yes, there is a tool with a nice flute that we know it's called Clovis. But if you're having a culture, you're having music, you're having spirituality, you're having food practices, you're having clothing, you're having housing, you're having yearly seasonal activities. That's a culture. One stone tool is not a culture. One stone tool was shared with a lot of people everywhere in the Americas. So what I have found through my research is that there are actually hundreds of stories held in the land, archaeological sites, that are older than 11 to 12,000 years before present in both North and South America, and evidence of mammalian migrations between the Western and Eastern hemispheres across millions of years. So these are two maps from my book, The Indigenous Paleolithic.
Mm.
And this is just basically some of the sites in both North and South America that predate 11,200 years before present. So this is about 146 sites, I think. Right now, my database sits at almost 600. So when the second book comes out, you're going to see a lot more sites on these maps, and I'll go into that later. But the existence of ancestral sites dating to the Pleistocene creates a dialogue from which Indigenous people can challenge erasures of histories. It foregrounds their Indigenous identities and their links to the land, and it empowers them in seeking justice. I have also found that events held in oral traditions and oral histories carry knowledge of extinct species and Indigenous peoples' deep history from the Pleistocene to the present. So in the Americas, the deep Indigenous past prior to 12 to 14,000 years before the present has been aggressively denied for over a century. Thankfully, the voices of the deniers are growing smaller and smaller. But anthropologists' denial of deep Indigenous histories has cleaved Indigenous peoples' links to their homelands and created them as recent immigrants from Asia and Europe. Yet, as we all know, Asia and Europe did not exist during the Pleistocene. There were no Asian cultures. There were no European cultures during the Pleistocene. What existed were early humans residing on the continents of the Eastern and Western hemispheres. There were no distinctive cultural groups known as Europeans and Asians during the Pleistocene. Yet you continually, to this day, hear archaeologists and geneticists describing the Indigenous people of the Americas as the descendants of Asians from Asia. There were no Asians in Asia 13, 14,000 years ago. So that is scientifically unsound and incorrect. Yet it is used as a geopolitical identifier to erase Indigenous identities. Geopolitical terminologies are incorrectly used to make claims that Asians and Europeans settled the Americas. Such normalized and embedded discussions continue to erase Indigenous peoples' histories and links to the land. To further support the erasure of Indigenous peoples, archaeologists normalized the mysterious disappearance of Indigenous people, including the Clovis people. And in many cases, assuming that today's contemporary Indigenous people are not related to the first people. And so there's a continual push to cleave links between contemporary Indigenous people and their ancient sites. This assures archaeologists that contemporary Indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere are not related to the earliest people to have lived in the Western Hemisphere, and thus have no claims to antiquity, lands, artifacts, human remains, or deep history. Thus, archaeologists who use the archaeology as their capital retain power and control and ownership over the past and archaeology sites. However, the first people and their descendants are indigenous to the continents of the Western Hemisphere and have been so for thousands of years. The Western Hemisphere is where their cultures, identities, and life ways were born. This is where they are from. Indigenous stories are literal and metaphorical and meant to be woven through minds and hearts across time as listeners grow into an understanding of all our relations and their place among them. So this is North America, just at the beginning of the last glacial maximum. So this is when first people apparently were supposed to come here, according to a lot of archaeologists. As you can see, there is no viable migration path for humans or mammals from about 24,000 years before present to maybe 10 or 11,000 years before present, there was just miles and miles, thousands of miles deep ice. Nothing was growing on the land. However, this is North America 2 million years ago. So as you can see, there is no glaciation. From what I've read, most of the continent was a subtropical forest, and there were land connections. So there were at least 6 to 8, if not more times over the last 2 million years when we saw both the Eastern and the Western hemisphere providing very viable migration routes between the East and the West with a land connection. So what did the Eastern hemisphere look like during the Pleistocene? As you can see by this map, we know that early hominids or early humans, early hominids were in Northern Asia as early as 2.4 million years ago, right?
Yeah.
And so we know that all over the area that we know today as Asia and Europe, we had early people had left Africa, migrated 14,000 kilometers to Northern Asia, got to that nasty little toll bridge at the Bering Land area and couldn't go any further and said, oh, I guess we'll stop here. Meanwhile, somehow the mammals got around the toll bridge because paleontology gives us this amazing record of mammalian migrations, which is very helpful because wherever our four-legged ancestors went, the two-legged could go. So what do you see in this picture that looks at all Canadian, right? The geese in the sky.
The geese.
Because this is Ellesmere Island 3.5 million years ago. Camelids arose in the Americas. For them to get to what we know today as Asia or anywhere else in the world, they couldn't fly like the geese, they had to walk. So they needed a viable migration route. They needed grazing lands, they needed fresh water, they needed to be able to cross an area where they weren't gonna freeze their little hoofies off after, 10,000 miles or 1,200 miles of ice. Okay. So, they wouldn't have crossed somewhere where there was no food. So we know that there's many times over millions and hundreds of thousands of years that camels went back and forth. And they weren't the only ones. Another of our four-legged relations that arose in North America that traveled to the rest of the world is the horse. So the earliest dawn horse is known from the Americas. They also needed very supportive, viable migration routes that had food, that had water, that had open spaces for large herds of animals. And another critter that arose in the Americas likely followed the horses and the camels to what we know today as Asia because they like to eat them. But the oldest basal species of saber-toothed cat anywhere in the world is known from Florida. And I think it was maybe 5 million years ago.
Wow.
So anyways, we have this really, really strong paleontological record that has tracked everything from hippopotamus to mammoth to saber-tooth to lizards, tracked the species of mammals and wherever they traveled and when they traveled. So we know where they first arose and where they traveled to. So once again, remember, if something as big as camels and horses and saber-tooths could migrate back and forth, so too then could humans.
Wow.
This is a picture of the Cactus Hill site. So the Cactus Hill site predated Clovis, and the McAvoys said they invested more time and money defending their dates and conducting new tests than they had ever imagined because they were aggressively critiqued and attacked when they announced dates older than Clovis at the Cactus Hill site. And although they think that the antiquity of the site has been established, the effort has been stressful. And if they were to do it all over again, they sometimes think they wouldn't dig so deep. So this is what kept history hidden in the Americas for hundreds of years. It was anger, hate, racism, and violence coming from archaeologists who did not want Indigenous people to have been here longer than 11 to 12,000 years before present. And that's, I don't know what else you call that if it's not racism, but Cactus Hill did stand the test of time. I'm very grateful for people like the McAvoys who had the courage to tell the truth about the dates from their sites.
Yeah.
Because I have heard from others who are still afraid to publish on earlier dates.
Wow.
This is the Topper site in South Carolina, right along the Georgia line. And this site, Alan Goodyear dug deeper to look at soils, and what happened was, oops, he found more tools below Clovis. Obviously, they weren't Clovis tools. And he said he knew he had crossed the line in challenging the orthodoxy of North American archaeology. And he said, it was a weird feeling to be putting a career of 30 years on the table, but there was no turning back.
Yeah.
And 50,000 years ago. Wow.
Right. And Douglas Sain, a graduate student, did a monster dissertation on this, where he showed the tools that were found to be 50,000 years old were human constructed tools and were used by humans. So this site is constantly ignored, not because it isn't a good site. It has awesome dates. Anybody working on an older than Clovis site is going to be like the McAvoy said, extremely careful. They're going to do 10 times more dating, 10 times more testing, because they know they're going to face unorthodox, violent critiques from a bunch of angry archaeologists. So they are extremely careful in what they do. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate people like Alan Goodyear.
Mm-hmm. Standing up
This
to go where the evidence leads. Yeah.
Right, and telling the truth. This is the Lacina site in northwest Nebraska. And what you see here, this is a big rock berm the government paid to have that rock berm constructed there to protect the site when the reservoir rises. And what I'm doing there is I'm trying to look very scientific, because I know they're taking pictures. And then at the end of the day, I realized all day while I posed for their very scientific pictures, I had my t-shirt on inside out. So, but what I'm doing is this site had excavations here done for over 11 years. There were a lot of field schools, a lot of research done on this site. And then the site was backfilled, but there's a big area of the site that was never excavated. So in some areas of this cut bank, artifacts are continually eroding. So we go out every summer, somebody goes out and collects any of the eroding artifacts, which is mammoth or mastodon bone that's been spirally fractured. So this site dated to 22,000 years before present. It's only one of just a few that was reported on by Dr. Steve Holen from the Denver Museum. And it's one of the sites that I did my field work on. So I'm probably one of the extremely few graduate students, that ever got to work on Pleistocene age archaeology sites in North and South America.
Wow.
They got to publish about it. I'm hearing about more and more students now that worked on all of these sites that I report on, which is fabulous, because then their minds are open to the possibilities of doing more research in this area. So this is the Lacina area. Number one is the Lacina site. When I was doing my field research, I began to look at sites that had been reported in published academic literature. And every time I found one site, I found 20, 30, 40 more sites in the area. So each of these sites, and this is what you would expect, people didn't fall out of a plane and live in one place. You would expect, where else did they go? Where did, their daughter married that guy and they went over there. Where's that? And so you would expect to find other sites. And that's what we see around all of the Pleistocene sites that I've researched. There is a regional area. So all of these sites date from 14,000 to 22,000 years. Only two of them are younger than 16,000.
Wow.
Some of them have stone tools, but they all have spirally fractured mammoth bones. So early humans, the only way to break a big mammoth femur, a bear couldn't even crack those bones, is to take a small boulder and bash on it till it breaks. Early humans really liked the food inside, the marrow, it's high protein. but also the bone. It made really strong, really good tools. So when we find spirally fractured bone, there's been a lot of research done on this. People that know what they're doing can tell if it was broken by humans or if it was an accidental break. And all of these sites have mammoth bone that was butchered by humans.
Wow.
So this is a highway berm in California where they found the Siberia site. So the Siberia site was found, they were building a little east-west connector highway between the coast and the inland highway number 15. And when they started clearing the land for that, they found over 114 sites. But when they found the Siberia site, some of the geologists and archaeologists that worked for California State recognized right away that this was not just a site where some big mastodon laid down and died. Somebody had placed femur heads together. Somebody had placed ribs together. This was very suspect of being a human site. Now, California has very unique soils because of all of the land eruptions they have there, all of the plates moving and the land moving around. So CalDOT, the California Transportation Authority, has people who are really, really specialized in the area of reading the soils. And they knew these soils were really, really old. So a lot of archaeologists worked on this site. They curated the artifacts at the Museum of Man for, I think, over 10 years. Until dating got to a place where it could not be questioned. They were waiting for dating technologies to be improved because they figured this was over 100,000 years old, right? And when they finally got this tested, it was 130,000 years old. And what you see on this mammoth bone here up on the left, you see this nice little curve on the top. That's an impact point where someone took one of those boulders to break that bone open. So we also found these little boulders used to crack open all this bone, and they didn't naturally belong at that site. This was not a fluvial site. So believe me, the scientists and archaeologists that worked on the Siberia site before it was published went 1,000 times above and beyond what you'd have to do for a normal site. They were so careful. They knew they'd face really violent rhetoric, and they did. But they got it published because it was scientifically sound. So this is number one, where the Siberia site is. Number three is the Calico site. Louis Leakey worked on this site, and he said there were levels that dated from 40,000 to 200,000 years. Apparently, when he published on that, he was called a crazy old man and a drunkard. This is your preeminent world paleontologist, right, that found early humans in South Africa. This is a man who knows what he's talking about. But when he said a site in North America was older than Clovis, he was just a drunken old man.
So even he was subject to character assassination for what he found.
Absolutely. You know, and when you look around this area, there's another 8 sites around the Siberia site that predate 40,000 years before present by typology. That's the type of stone tools. So they weren't dated, but the depth the tools were found out and the typology of the tools, they're reported being at least 40,000 years old. South of here in central Mexico, around a reservoir, there are 5 more sites that date from 40,000 to 200,000 years old. The United States Geological Survey are the ones that dated that site, those sites. They got it right, right? There were stone tools buried at depths with these ages. And so once again, you see an area that is a regional area of sites that date from 40,000 to 200,000 years before present. And you have to remember, if people lived at number 1 and people lived at number 3, no doubt they went between number 1 and number 3, and number 3 and number 2, and number 3 and number 5. And so we could be out there looking for these sites, right? There are a lot of sites along the coast of California that come out along the cut bank, along the ocean, that are very, very, very deep. And that's because soils accumulate over time, and in some areas they accumulate at a much quicker rate. In some areas, what we call the Pleistocene loess, that dates at its oldest to 26,000, 28,000, might be 62 feet deep. In other areas, it might be 2 feet deep. We don't know. Like White Sands has footprints at the surface because the wind is moving the sand. So constant environmental processes change the depth of sites, and most sites have been found when there's been like a collapse or a flood, and then we see things coming out of a cut bank. So anyways, I began my research journey by asking questions regarding the paleo-environmental possibilities of Pleistocene migrations and of the evidence for pre-Clovis sites in the Western Hemisphere. From what I have learned, I argue there is a vast body of evidence that supports initial migrations to the Western Hemisphere much earlier than the dates for Clovis. And from what I've recently learned in the last 6 months, as early as 300,000 years. So Vine Deloria Jr. argued that unless and until Indians are in some way connected with world history as early peoples, we will never be accorded full humanity. And what a lot of people don't realize, because they're not taught this, is that the impact of archaeological knowledge production on Indigenous people, it's often discussed by archaeologists who recognize the archaeological record used to interpret and construct the past has power in the present. So discourses on the histories of Indigenous people, historically framed in Eurocentric conjecture, are more a product of powerful ideologies based on a colonial past than they are of the known archaeological record. So I was really surprised when I asked Dr. Holland, did he know of any sites earlier than Clovis? And he sent me a list of 10 sites, and he said, don't tell anybody what you're studying. They're just going to call you crazy. Well, if it's going to be your dissertation, you got to tell somebody. But I started looking at those sites. Every paper I read talked about this site, this site, this site. In 2 weeks, I had a list of over 500 sites that predated Clovis. And let me share you this bit of history I just found out. All of my work to date has been based on published archaeological academic papers that could not be questioned. And even if they could be questioned, they were academic, they were published, they were peer-reviewed. What I have found is that in what we call the gray literature, so all of those archaeological sites that cultural resource management companies excavate for pipelines, for roads, for bridges, those sites are held in each state and each province's repository. And so when I worked as a field archaeologist, I would go to those repositories and look for all of the sites previously documented in a given area that we were about to do some work in.
Okay.
So all that information is there. What I found out is that in Arizona alone, there are 1,400 sites that predate Clovis in the gray literature. So if I were to go or create a team and go to every state and provincial office and gather information from the gray literature, which includes sites that all have to be dated, all have to be well documented, there would be thousands and thousands of sites that predate Clovis.
So by gray literature, you mean it's not published?
It's not
just
published in
kind of
an
hidden.
academic paper, but it is held in a governmental office, provincial, state, federal. Every state, every province has an office.
And so it doesn't see the light of day in a wider
Right.
spectrum. It's not being challenged.
Right. And
It's
so
just
you
hidden.
actually have to be an archaeologist with a contract working in a specific area to go into that office and study their records.
Wow.
So Linda Tuwali Smith is a Maori scholar, and she said it's no surprise that one of the first aspects of Indigenous being that suffered from intentional eradication by colonizing forces were histories, which testified to a deep, ancient, and civilized past. And histories which extend from the ancient past to the living present are pivotal for cultural survival. There are many costs for the uncritical acceptance of knowledge produced via biases used to filter these data, such as the Clovis first hypothesis of initial migrations. In the case of the uncritical acceptance of late dates of initial migrations to the Western Hemisphere, it's not just the archaeologists who supported arguments for earlier sites who suffered from academic bashing and an overly critical gaze of their research. The greatest price has been paid by the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, who have long endured soul wounds and social and political disparities created in part through archaeological cleaved links to ancestral places and times. And I work to rewrite Indigenous history because all of these archaeologists that documented it, they got it right. And they're right to remain open-minded. Everywhere in the world, we see in the last 10 years, our understanding of human migrations and evolutions has been greatly informed and greatly changed. Because we have better science, because we're doing more excavations, because we're finding out more. But according to some American archaeologists, it's never supposed to change in the Americas. Everywhere else in the world, yes. So I came up with a word in 2012. Like, how can I discuss this to include our knowledge? Well, we used fire to clean the land. When you clean the land, you make space for the indigenous plants to come up, for the sunlight to nurture them to grow. So pyroepistemology is a metaphorical terminology that describes the work of critical indigenous scholarship and the decolonizing work carried out by our like-minded and informed peers and allies. A practice of pyroepistemology is a ceremony that cleanses the academic landscape of discussions that misinform worldviews and fuel racism. Such literary renewal clears the way for healthy growth in academic fields of thought and centers of knowledge production. We have a responsibility to the next 7 generations to critique and rewrite Western history, to weave indigenous knowledge throughout education, and to continue the work of healing and repatriation. I couldn't have gotten anywhere on my work if it wasn't for a very dedicated group of settler archaeologists that put their careers on the line and stuck their neck out even when they knew they would be attacked, and all they were doing was telling the truth. Right now, I'm working on a second book to include at least 60 of those archaeologists to honor them, to discuss their accomplishments and their archaeological work. That book should be out in 2024. So rewriting Western data and indigenous history is a praxis that weaves indigenous knowledge and settler knowledge through literature and stories, and pushes back on misinformation and discrimination and racism, creating peace and making the world a better place for all people. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. Talk, talk, talk.
Congratulations
Wow.
on
Well,
putting all this together. Oh, wow. So where do we begin?
right. First of all, I just want to say, very profound, convincing to be able to have the story told from the perspective. I love the fact that you took the time to put together all the details of the migrations of different animals, of wildlife, and saying somehow wildlife can do it, but humanity can't. I mean, it's just like, it's so convincing to think of it from that point of view. It's like, why is it taking so long for this to be a mainstream idea?
Well, it is curious to think that North America and South America just lay empty for so many millennia when the rest of the world was colonized.
Yeah, we were waiting for Columbus to arrive.
That we covered the story of the Polynesian oral tradition of navigating the huge Pacific by the stars. They could bump into Hawaii, but not the coasts of the Americas. I
Right.
mean, even that story. So you could colonize Australia by boat 80,000 years ago, probably much, much further back, but not the Americas. I mean, it just wasn't ever logical.
And back and forth,
Yeah.
back and forth.
And I remember really covering Clovis back in the late 1990s on radio. And they're like, more Clovis sites, more. Well, these people must have been running to put all these Clovis. How about they were already here,
Yeah.
right? There's other explanations. So yeah, thanks
This
for
is
the
all
eye-opening
just, yeah,
presentation.
And you know, this evidence of how early humans and early mammals navigated the world. First of all, I forgot one thing. There's
Yeah.
no such thing as the old world and the new world. There is
Mhm.
one world. It is
Thank you.
all very old,
Love that.
right? And early hominids and early mammals were traveling all over the world. They were highly capable
Yeah.
100,000 years ago, apparently, of using boats. But you know, more recently, we are still getting evidence. So a fox was collared in Norway. Where do you think that fox went? All on his own with no boat. He went to Ellesmere Island,
Oh,
right? Thousands of miles. Mammals today can still travel intercontinentally without the help of human ingenuity. So, so we're still seeing you know, more and more evidence being brought forward of how early humans and mammals migrated the earth. But yeah, to think that, you know, early humans walked or migrated 14,000 kilometers from Africa to Northern Asia and then stopped. And the Bering landmass is 57 miles across. Like, come on.
yeah.
You know, mammals were coming and going, but yeah, they didn't want to go over there. Like, no, there's so much that was never questioned. And that's really the disturbing part, because our job as archaeologists is to understand human history, to question. And when you look around the world, they're doing an amazingly great job of that, finding Denisovians, finding new species,
Yeah.
figuring out who they're related to, right? From tiny pieces of bone. Now we can use dirt to get DNA that will give us a biosignature of a mammal or a human or a species. And so I'm hoping in the next 3 to 4 years that I will be able to collect some deep soil cores and do some of that work myself, because they found signals in the Americas, that early human signals, biomarkers that date to over 30,000 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one can just imagine what's there under our current level of sea level, because these levels have gone up and down. So
Right.
there's another
Yeah.
whole strip. You said something important, the deep civilized past. And I think the same is true for early humans all over the world, is that we're not giving them credit, from the Neanderthal to the Cro-Magnon to all of those generations of humans, so highly sophisticated, so clever with the materials that they had on hand, so sophisticated, cognitive spectrum of knowledge. And every time we sit down at the dinner table, we are really celebrating what the first peoples in the Americas gave us in terms of all of the hybridized foodstuffs, where there's such a rich history that we're not acknowledging of the contributions. So
yeah, 50% of the world's major food crops come from North and South America.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Well, we do
So
have, go ahead.
the chat room has been blowing up. So
Yeah.
many
We
good
do have
questions.
and we'll have ways that
Yeah.
everybody can join in on the discussion. First of all, we have Tony Hull has his hand up. Go ahead and raise your hands if you want to also join in the discussion. I'm not going to go back through and read everybody's chat. Just go ahead and ask it live. And Tony is an associate professor at the University of New Mexico as an astronomer and astrophysicist. Hi, Tony.
Who's done a lot of
Actually,
archaeoastronomy as well.
Yeah.
Hey, Tony.
Actually, I'm an adjunct professor and not an associate professor, but that's just a minor detail.
Okay.
Paulette, I really enjoy your presentation. You have many findings and a great perspective, which I really like in many ways. But in one, I have to kind of ask you a question. I studied archaeology as a freshman at the University of Pennsylvania. My professor was notable. He was the director of the University Museum. His name was Froelich Rainey. He was president of the American Academy of Sciences, and he even had a TV show called What in the World.
Hmm.
He was a remarkably prominent person in archaeology. On my term paper I turned in, he wrote back the words, and this is 1962. Um, the population of the Americas is far more complex than the theory of the land bridge. So even with somebody as prominent as this, there seems to have been this bias against this. Now, this bias I've never heard directly. I mean, I know that science sometimes holds on to things, but I've never heard this directly, including, I went through the certificate program at UCLA. I chaired a major conference in archaeology. I presented at professional societies, and yet I've never heard a direct bias that you can't say this because any reason. And it would seem to be totally inconsistent with the political climate, even over the last decades. So uh, my thinking is the resistance is simply we've been waiting for a book like yours, not that people are wanting to put down Indigenous people. As a matter of fact, most people in archaeology have a deep love for Indigenous culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, people repeat what they're taught. So I was watching some crime show one night and they did this social networking theory to find the criminals. And I'm like, well, you could use social networking theory to trace back across time, maybe to look at social networking of, and breeding grounds of mammoths and mastodons. And then I thought, wait a minute, you could apply this to archaeologists. So if we look at archaeologists today that make some really strong statements that are kind of out of place with contemporary archaeology, that dehumanize Indigenous people or deny their rights to, human remains or areas or artifacts, you could probably do a social networking theory and trace them back to who did they learn that from. So if you go back, to the early, 1920s, 1930s, and the first professors that taught archaeology in America. One guy taught for 45 years at Yale, and he was absolutely an avowed racist. They passed that on. So how many generations is it passed on until somebody goes, wait a minute, or they hear from another area, or they start to bring in other ideologies. I think we're at a pretty good place now where a new group of archaeologists that are coming in are getting more information. They're getting it from Native American studies. They're getting it from some archaeologists. They're getting it from geologists. They're getting it from, all kinds of people that are working with and weaving Indigenous knowledge throughout their work. So I think we're at a really good place now. I think if we were doing social networking theory, that it would get really small here. And then from now on, it would totally expand and change. But if we used it to go back in time and do an archaeological genealogy, I have no doubt everybody would be linked to some of those first 5 or 10 professors that were avowed racists, the ones that started the eugenics movement of the Americas, the ones that provided the blueprint for the Nazis. This is what I'm talking about. And this is in chapter 2 of my book.
Yeah, I mean, this is very far from the mainstream of archaeology. Eugenics is something that's a thing of the past. And yes, there were famous figures of 100 years ago or more that were on the wrong side of history now, let me put it that way. So I'm totally agreeing with that. But in my field, astrophysics, there's nothing more exciting than finding evidence that violates the given theory of how the universe is formed or where the universe is. This is where all the juice is. This is where the funding goes. This is really great on that. So I want to mention that. The other thing that I maybe is hopeful. You mentioned all the records that were found in Arizona and similar around the world. The people who go and do that are not hacks. They're not amateurs. They're contract archaeologists. And these are still archaeologists. They're engaging. They go to the major archaeological meetings. They're involved. They may not be teaching, but they are definitely have an impact. So if they are finding and putting these dates on things, nobody high is going to say, "Oh no, that's wrong," or they're going to say, "BS." We
Yeah.
have the evidence. So anyway, I think that the book that you've done, the presentation, the body of work you're presenting is really great, and I just hope that we don't have to dwell too much on the idea of conspiracy, because I don't think that. I mean, clearly there are bad things in the past, and
Oh,
but I think we're not there now, and everything I've seen in archaeology has been quite open, particularly the last. I mean, there have been unpopular topics. I mean, only recently could you talk about the shamanic theory of rock art, but now you can. But the things are evolving, and so I know what you're talking about, but I'm hoping that we can go on the positive basis of this lovely collection of data, as opposed to pointing fingers at the evil of what a few people might have done.
yeah.
I
Thank you,
agree that
Tony.
you can't paint a whole field with that paintbrush today. I think things have so evolved, but I do remember like 20 years ago talking with Virginia Steen McIntyre, Betty Megers, Vine Deloria,
We had many
and they're
conferences with
bitterly
Vine.
complaining about
Yeah.
getting squashed when they're trying to propose these earlier dates when they are simply following where the evidence leads.
And-
I had those conversations,
Yeah,
but that
but
was a
again-
couple decades ago, Tony. So
Yeah, things have
things have
changed.
changed. And
let me say, going back 60 years ago to possibly the most prominent archaeologist in America, he was stating that things were far more complicated than the land bridge.
Ah,
Even that
yeah.
came off the rail. So
Yeah.
we've known for a while, and archaeology has been trying to work this. And it's still a mystery to me why we're so stuck, but that's a whole nother thing. But
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you,
There's a
Tony.
number
There's
of,
much to celebrate here. Yeah.
there's a number of people that are still very strong deniers, and if you could read their critiques and the emails that Steve Holland and his team received after the Soretti site, you
Oh,
would be absolutely floored. And so, you talked about speaking 20 years ago with Vine Deloria Jr. and others. And so the reality of this for me is that a big piece of the healing moving forward for Indigenous people is a public acknowledgement of the truth,
yeah.
a public acknowledgement of the denial. So this is an Indigenous practice in many areas of the world. We must publicly acknowledge and call out those who have harmed us. And believe me, I will continue to do so. So in my next book, where I'm going to discuss 60 archaeologists, you're going to be able to read some of their experiences. And I'm horrified for what Steve Holland and his wife, Kathy Holland, went through, because they did very, very good work on the Soretti site. But they were, the over aggressiveness of the attack against them
Mhm.
was not scientific. It
Could
was
I,
not scientific.
could I add a comment?
Oh, yeah.
Something that would be wonderful if you could instigate at something like the Society of American Archaeology or one of the other major conferences would be a session devoted to exactly this topic.
Oh, yeah.
And people react far differently when they're eyeball to eyeball. They're more
Oh,
able
yeah.
to listen. People shout when they write,
absolutely.
but they listen when they talk, or they look like jerks, and nobody wants to look like a jerk in a conference. So if I could recommend that, I would love to see you do that. And when you do it, I would love to come to there and be there to listen and
That's
support.
Good advice.
Thank you,
Tony.
Tony.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have
The next
probably,
one-
go ahead.
The next one's in New Orleans, and I promised a few people I'm going to try and make it. I got to get on that, but
Yeah.
the book has kept me so busy.
That
Oh
would
my
be a
It's
good
goodness.
one
hard
to
being
do.
popular. Yeah.
We'll propose a special session. I would love to see that.
Yes, absolutely. This needs to be out there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay,
What's
so
next?
we have quite a few hands up. So I
Yeah.
want Naseo, do you have your video on? Or
Yes, I see it.
Okay, here we go.
Yes, I do. Hi.
Hello.
My name is Nisao Ogata. I am a professor at the University of Veracruz in Mexico.
Ah.
Welcome.
And the first thing that I want to say is that I am a very, very big fan of Dr. Steeves. And since I read her book, I already incorporated in my class. I am an ethnobotanist,
Mhm.
and I am a specialist in the study of the chocolate plant.
Oh, wow.
So for me, it has been very, very, very revealing, all the evidence that she has been putting, because we are doing some sort of the same decolonization processes here in Mexico, especially now that the history of the conquest, it has been rewritten.
Yes.
Mhm.
For example, now the new writings have shown how the Hernán Cortés conqueror, in his letter of relations, was copying the writings that have been done for Alexander the Great. He just copy and paste,
Ah,
and he tried to make all the history where the indigenous people just surrendered because they saw a white man arriving from the sun. So that's why I'm so thrilled with the book of Dr. Steeves,
yes.
and I really wanted to congratulate her, because the other thing that I wanted to highlight is that the same way researchers have been hiding the archaeological findings,
Yes.
is the same thing that many researchers have been doing to hide the profound, the deep traditional knowledge that indigenous people have had on the management of tropical rainforest.
Yes.
In the case of cacao, new findings in
Mhm.
Ecuador have shown that indigenous people in that area were using the cacao, the chocolate plant,
Mhm.
since at least 5,000 years old.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So everything is changing, and the other thing that I loved is when Dr. Steeves talk about this. There's no a Clovis culture, and obviously,
Yeah.
obviously, because here, for example, in Mexico, we have such a diversity, more than 50 different cultures, and more than 300 languages and
Mhm.
dialects. So it's impossible that a single culture will thrive in all this diversity of environments and
Right.
landscapes, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So my
Thank you.
congratulations to Dr. Steeves, and just to let her know that her book now is part of my class in the ethnobotany course.
Beautiful.
Could you
Thank you.
please, could
Thank
you please write to us so we can ask you to talk with us about chocolate and the rainforest and the
Cacao.
plants? Please
course.
drop us a line.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of
You're
course,
invited
I
to come
will.
back and tell us more.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
I will send you my email, and let's talk about chocolate, because it has
Let's celebrate
a lot of,
chocolate and more
I
of
love
these
it.
beautiful
Yes.
indigenous, and yeah, thank you so much, sir.
Cuyamonga Institute at gmail.com. Cuyamonga Institute at gmail.com. Okay, let's
But
take.
you might want to reply,
Oh, yeah,
and then
please
we'll,
reply.
yeah,
Paul.
yeah, and then we'll go to our next, yeah,
Good.
okay.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
Audrey has her hand up. She's right here.
Thank you. I'm just a layperson that I teach and share about the archaeological as well as food security of Indigenous people here in Winnipeg, Canada. And I had the honor to meet Dr. Lee Sims, who was an archaeologist here and he's since retired. But he spoke to me of phytoliths that were found in pots of all the different food items that were here that had been used in Manitoba and north of Winnipeg, and how far back they went. But, you know, when we talk about, things, the negative scientists in the past and their views, but yet we still are having them. And an example is, before he retired, they were wanting to break ground for the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and the items found there were bulldozed. He was not allowed to categorize or analyze other than a few hundred pieces, which were phenomenal in his eyes, but it was all bulldozed, as well as
Bulldozed artifacts.
Oh,
No,
yes.
bulldozed artifacts. By
Yeah.
whom? For what was the excuse?
Well, you needed the Canadian Museum of Human Rights was erected there.
So that we don't have a federal system in Canada. Every province has its own system for cultural heritage and for archaeology. And so there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed. And I always encourage Indigenous communities, if something is going on that's deeply disturbing the soil, get out there and watch it and take pictures. Because our history is still constantly bulldozed, right?
Oh,
The
very
government
much
loves
so.
it. Yeah.
I myself had gone to when they were wanting to further develop the waterfront, and I was literally banned from the building. But I was just, a layperson in their eyes, I guess. But there again, it's hard when you have Indigenous peoples who actually were at the ceremony, groundbreaking ceremony, giving authority to do so.
Mhm.
But my question is, do you think that since I myself deal with this quite often when I share knowledge on Indigenous food, because I'm a grower, and I get a lot of flack from people who do not believe the earth is older than 6,000 years
Oh.
and believe in the doctrine of discovery. Few people know actually what the doctrine of discovery
Why don't you tell us?
Well, in my ground view, just a regular person here, it is a papal bull that was written by the Pope back in the 1600s that gave the doctrine of discovery of land. Anything that is discovered by a Christian would be then come under Christian rule. And if the people therein were refused to convert, you were allowed to enslave them. And if they still refused to enslavement, they were allowed to be killed.
Mm.
And yes, it's a long document, but also the Indian Act of Canada, I found, is very restrictive of Indigenous people's ability to grow food as well as feed their own people. Luckily, I fall under one of the groups that kind of got kicked off the treaty list a couple generations ago. And so I don't fall under that rule, but I still get a lot of flack from people who just refuse to believe that Indigenous people were not this romanticized Hollywood thing of roaming the bison and berries idea, and yet majority of the food you eat is from originally here, right?
Yes.
Now
Yeah,
we're
it's
growing
really
with
sad that the prairies of Canada is in many ways so far behind anything social or political, even in the rest of the world. You have a lot of people that were Christian fundamentalists, and that's the only thing they believe. They're in a very small vacuum. And there's more of a high percent of them in the prairies in Canada, which is really sad because, it's an area where, a big part of my own family came from Red River and from Manitoba. And the artifacts that are held within the land, the sites and the stories across the prairies are absolutely immense. And I think one of the things you could do, or we could do, is work to try to create a group that would help to protect or document sites before they are destroyed, and to change the laws in Canada and maybe even get a federal law for cultural heritage. So that's a big piece of work, but that's really what we need to do, is we need to create a federal law, like something like NAGPRA, Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which is the federal law in the United States. We need to create something like that for Canada. So that means you got to start politicking and making friends with politicians and raising funds and doing a lot of things. But that is a big piece of work that I hope that, one day we can start and be successful at.
Yes, I found it very surprising that in Neepawa, just west of Winnipeg here, there's an elder that told me of the turtle mound that was there. The tail of the turtle was 40 feet long.
Oh,
And
my.
the whole mound was all the gravel. But in 1922, he said they dismantled it. The contents of the skeletons and other people's are in the basement of the Museum of Man, never to be seen again. And all the gravel is what paved the way for the railroad.
Yeah.
All that gravel that's on the railroad.
So they used it as a
built up.
handy source for
I
ready
see.
source of gravel.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's
It's
the hard
shocking
thing
today
is,
that these finds aren't protected, that somebody doesn't come in
well,
and say, shut it down, shut down the construction. Let's look at, I thought that was just the norm now.
but this is 1920s. It was even
No, I
worse.
know, but she's saying,
No, but it's not the
No.
norm in Canada. It's not the norm in Canada at all. And in lots of
Sure.
places in the United States, there's a lot of great cultural resource management firms, but there's a lot that line their pockets with millions of dollars to look the other way. And believe me, I was fired off my last 3 CRM jobs in the United States because I refused to lie that there were sites where they wanted to put drilling pads and oil roads.
Mm,
exactly.
Yeah,
So
there's a
money
lot of
wins.
destruction of Indigenous sites going on in both countries. At least though in the US you have NEGPRA. In
Yeah.
Canada, we have nothing but little bits of
Yeah.
different laws in each province.
mm.
Well, I know Dr. Sims's last dig site was off the bridge of Lockport. And in that's where they found in-ground granaries that had been storage of seeds and food and dried foods and such. But the trouble he had with government and people who did not want that acknowledged
Right.
was,
well, were the
I find,
seeds retrieved?
horrendous.
Because that's a valuable cultural heritage right there, is the seeds.
Mhm.
Well, and that's the problem when you have a society that is based upon superiority,
Yeah.
Mhm.
because they have this idea that only the Europeans did everything and the natives were just a bunch of, hide wearing lowlifes. And we
Mm.
still get treated like that. We still get treated like that to this day. So saying it is only in the past, no, it's not. It's continuing to this very day. And I do get a lot of backlash from a lot of those type of people because they do not want it acknowledged that Native people were very much food secure, as well as culture, as well as whole townships and farmers. Because
Mhm.
the thing about the prairies here is, oh, well, they came over and they settled the land and farmed the land. Well, no, you didn't. It was already being farmed.
Right.
And we
And
did test sites.
managed better
Yeah.
than we can do today in terms of preserving the
Oh, yeah,
prairie, the
yeah, yeah.
soil, keeping the indigenous plants, clearing that. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I
it's a-
appreciate it. Even Tony is saying bulldozing is hard to accept or even understand in Germany. So it's not just in the Americas. He's citing the largest temple of Isis. I think this is in
Northern Europe.
yeah, was bulldozed, 80% of it in favor of a shopping mall.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank
Yeah,
you. I
it
know
happens around the
Tyler
world.
was going to have more stories on
Go,
this.
go ahead.
Thank you so
Paula.
much for those. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think in the prairies, what I need to do is do some fundraising and then rent a bunch of billboards and put my book up on billboards all across the prairie. I really
Yeah.
want to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, here we are trying to move the dial with dialogue, as I like to say.
Yeah, yeah.
Tyler, welcome back. I know you have more stories.
Well, I'm so excited to see you face to face again, Dr. Steeves. You know you are my hero and the hero of many of us who are doing this film right now. And Tony, I know you're this amazing gentleman, and it's hard for people who are kind to understand that this kind of thing really still exists. I have done some pretty heavy duty films and very difficult. And I have to say that this film is very difficult. This one about the cultural destruction of Native American history, of Indigenous history, is ongoing, and it is many complicated areas to it. I want to just tell you about one thing that happened to reiterate what Dr. Steeves was talking about. It was with Dr. Gramley and Sam Briggs, and we went to a site where there was Macedon bones that had been worked, and there was a body found. There were pieces of a body, shaman. And that has never been returned to the Tonawanda people. Despite even Nagpra, it's not been. And here's what happens. It was never dated. It's put somewhere, but I have it on film that it exists. And they stuck it in alcohol. They stuck the bones in alcohol, so it couldn't be, and they wouldn't even allow the dog that was found near it to be dated. So they completely deny that a person could have been, a shaman could have been buried with a dog and a young child under a Macedon. And the person who was an archaeologist, quite famous, because of his theory of creationism, it's a kind of religious belief, and I couldn't believe it myself, but I was explained that this is something that exists, that nothing can be more than 10,000 years old. Now, I would have thought that was a lot of bulwarky until, 2 years later, doing research and filming and watching how some of the archaeologists are being treated, like you stated, total pariahs when they do state something's older. I have to say that Dr. Groundley is always being misidentified as a person who does not know what he's talking about, when in fact he's one of the greatest scholars I've ever met, and he really has the wherewithal to dig deeper and to try to find the true identity of things. And he also works with Native American people, because if you don't know what you're looking at. Like John Brown said, if you don't know what you're looking at, how can you know what it is? And some archaeologists use their Eurocentric idea and they interpret things that they're finding. And sometimes without a THPO, which is a tribal historical preservation officer, or somebody who is a Native American, they really don't know what they're looking at. And they'll just put something to it and put it away. And right now, the big problem is industry, solar fields, just destroying places that are known to be archaeological sites, like in Massachusetts, and there's no end to it. And they are digging and destroying. And in fact, I'm going to a place in Florida that is just disgraceful, that is destroyed, like a amazing place. And this is going on right now. And, one of the themes that we were talking about when we were doing this film is something that Orwell said: the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. So yes, this was very intentional. I believe it is still intentional in some aspect, and it needs to be wiped out. And the only way it can be wiped out is with your book and with the films and with more knowledge and
Education.
and your book being in Mexico, and just keep doing it and don't give up. But, people, Native Americans are also, Indigenous people are also, compromised, because when they are working and they need to have money from permits and stuff, and they're being hired to, well, we have to build this here. Don't make too much of a fuss. If there's no burials, they don't do anything. They just cover it over. And that's happening a lot. And what are they supposed to do?
I want to say that we are one family of man, diversity and unity, yes,
Of
but
people.
it hurts all of us to deny any part of our true history.
Yeah.
All of us
Tribalization,
benefit
the
by
isolation. Yeah,
by
okay.
understanding who we truly are.
Well, it's really
as a
hurting.
whole.
When I was in a site with one of my friends, who's a Picasset, Wampanoag, and there was a site called King Philip's Cave, and that's all they could save from a solar site, a tiny strip of land. And you could hear cars on one side and the solar strip on the other, and there's this beautiful little paradise. It wasn't any bigger than my apartment here in Brooklyn. And it made me really sick, because it was so rich that one place, when you walked in, you knew something special was there. And when we went there, she was very excited to show me, but someone had vandalized it. And she started crying.
I would
So when you
imagine.
see that, and I really think we need to make people understand,
Yeah.
it hurts. It hurts people, and it has to stop. We have to preserve the history. We have to let people have access to their history and their sites
Well, yeah.
Thank
without
you.
fail. And it's not happening. They can't even go to their sites. The Picasset cannot go to their own site.
In my perspective, it's not just history for theirs, but history for all of us. I need to know. I want to be connected to all of this. I want to have that integration of the human story. I don't want to be separated out from it. I want to be able to support it. I want knowledge to flow in its purest form without that filter of trying to change the history, trying to change the direction of what should be known and not known.
Well, and also science needs to practice science and not propaganda.
Well, and there are many scientists that do, but there's
Yeah,
a
I know.
huge spectrum that it's
And we
not.
celebrate those
Yeah.
who are
Yeah.
following where the evidence leads. Tyler, when is your film expected to be out and available on this?
Well, right now we're doing research and filming because, as you know, when you're doing a documentary, you have to meet people, you have to find out where to go. I could do it real quick, get some funding and throw it out there and,
Maybe next
win a
year.
few awards. But I really, really want to change something. And I have to see Dr. Steeves. I have to raise money for that. I have to raise money to see a gentleman, a lawyer in Virginia, who's been saving Native American sites and making them historical sites. So I am meeting some amazing
That's
people.
going to be a fun story.
Yeah.
It is.
Keep
Greg-
us
yeah.
posted for sure.
Yeah. we'd
Greg
like-
Werkheiser, and I spoke with Mark Andrews of the Wampanoag yesterday. He knows Greg. And so this guy actually saves Native American sites. And actually, the next step is let the Native Americans to be stewards of their own sites. What an idea.
yeah.
So-
Do
So
it through
just
the legal
something-
process.
Yeah.
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 Thank you
Need
so
more of
much,
that.
Tyler, for your work. Yeah.
Thank you, Tyler.
Yeah.
See you
Yeah.
soon, Dr. Steeves.
Yeah.
Do you want to respond?
No, thank you. Look forward to. seeing the
Ah.
documentary
She
one
said it
day.
all. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
Lynn has her
Keep up the
hand
good
up.
work,
And if
Tyler.
somebody wants to follow Lynn, you raise your hand now. There's been several one-sentence questions over time, but they keep scrolling past me in the chat room. So if you want to get your one-sentence question in, you can raise your hand. Here we go.
Or a volunteer to read the chat and pose some of the most
Yeah,
pertinent. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Hi,
Okay.
Lynn.
Hi, Lynn.
Welcome.
Dr. Steeves, I've been enjoying your book and comparing it to everything in my genetic genealogy studies. And as far as the models we're offered to find out how we ended up in America, they're all the bad modern models. But your book helps me trace like 4 different lineages over from the African side using genetics and the things in your book. And when you enjoy this book as reference material, you can actually help yourself with your deeper genome. And this will, as people start joining into this data, they'll be able to follow the human trail out of Africa story and amend it severely. It needs a different trail because it looks like we've been circling the earth. Some of us have been using boats for so long that during the 2 interglacial periods when the ice caps were in the wrong place,
Yeah.
the North Pole was an archipelago. And I think that had a lot to do with part of what the doctor just told us. It might be reasonable to assume that when we came out of Africa, we ended up in Japan, going through Maori lands and coming straight up the South American coast into the north. The DNA is much heavier in the South of America, and it has a greater presence in age as far as what we get in modern humans who are alive and the few specimens we get. I so am looking forward to your next book, Dr. Steeves.
Thank you. We have to pose the questions. We have to be able to ask the questions,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you for that.
Dr. Steeves?
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing about DNA, the geneticists are great in making these broad sweeping claims. Now, some geneticists have recently changed, and they're weaving, like oral traditions and
Mhm.
culture through their genetic work. Like a group just
Yeah.
found in the northern Amazon where, a lot of early archaeologists said, oh, there weren't many people. Well, definitely there were a lot of people, and they were very diverse. And they actually found the first documented case of exogamic linguistics. So you marry outside of your linguistic group.
Mhm.
And so
Oh,
it was so diverse, but they knew that you needed to not marry inside your own language group or your own family. So
Mhm.
there, some geneticists are working really hard to create a holistic picture, right? Others take the little that we know. By the way, we have less than 1/10 of 1% of the ancient DNA of the Americas, and less than 5% of the DNA of the Americas. There may be a higher percent but in very small areas. We don't have a genetic picture of the Americas. We have a genetic picture of a couple of places of the Americas. You can't make broad sweeping claims on that. There is so much more to find out. And there's a number of genetic research pieces where there were 3 skeletons that melted out of a glacier in British Columbia a number of years back. And one of the males had the M haplotype. That's the oldest haplotype out of Africa. Why is nobody discussing that, right? Because
Yeah.
it doesn't fit with their paradigm. So a lot of geneticists have worked to fit whatever it is they find out to match the archaeological record. Thank goodness they're not all doing that anymore. And I think some are starting to change. They're starting to create a more holistic body of knowledge that includes, linguistics and cultures and genetics. And when it comes to linguistics, you would expect to find, the most language families where people had been in the world the longest, because
Yeah.
like George Nicholas says, it takes 6,000 years for a new language, even in a language family, to form.
Right.
Mhm.
But where do you think the most languages in the world are? 180 of the 340 language families in the world are from the Americas, 15 alone in
Mhm.
California. The greatest diversity of language anywhere in the world are in the Americas.
So it
How could
speaks
we
to
have-
its longevity of the
Yeah, exactly.
populations there.
So there's so many great questions left to be answered, and that linguistics is one of them,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
So we
Yeah.
need a lot of new graduate students in many areas.
And it makes you wonder how the picture would emerge if we didn't have the first colonial attitudes, right? If we
Right.
just started over, what picture would emerge?
Mm.
So, because
A
we've
very
had to
diverse
overcome.
picture.
A very
Yeah.
diverse picture. Yeah. Lynn, was that good? Thank you very much
Thank
for
you,
your
Lynn.
contribution.
Appreciate that. And we've got Sam Leon Briggs.
Yeah.
Leon Sam Briggs.
Well, I'll just call him Sam.
Sam. Yeah.
That works for me. I got to meet Dr. Steeves probably about 20 years ago when we were working on some of the things up in Canada. And then, being from northern Quebec up in James Bay there, I get to do a lot of traveling. But in the eastern part of the United States, I can give you a very, very long list of archaeologists that have a lot of issues with a lot of the native. And I've argued, I'm in just getting ready to unfortunately have to have a couple court battles with some of these in NAGPRA. One of the big problems with NAGPRA, there's so many things in NAGPRA that goes against us as Indigenous people, and supports a lot of the archaeology. And so when you get people like Mike Gramley and Jim Herod and these guys that are standing up for what is right, and we've talked about it, so many of these archaeologists that we know and that completely use religion and use other information and stuff against going past 10,000 years. And so unfortunately it's a battle that we still fight every day. And so when I'm like today, I'm actually speaking in Edinburgh, Pennsylvania. So I got to speak here in 15 minutes. But and that's one of the things that we've been talking about is decolonization. And in decolonization, one of the things that we teach in the language school and with our immersion schools is about the stone giants, is about the ones that drag your horns, which a lot of times we talk about that as being the mastodon, the woolly mammoth. And so there's a lot of stories that predate Clovis. And it's nice to see Dr. Steeves and people, you're recognizing, what is the truth. And I've heard, and I've talked to other archaeologists that have carbon dated stuff that went past, 20 and 30,000 years old. But when they do their write-ups, they don't include that because of, who's funding them, that they know that if they start pushing that envelope, that, it's going to be hard for them to find archaeology jobs and places to do. And I know there was a comment and stuff. They said that that the doctrine of discovery was descended and stuff with the Papal bulls. I hate to tell you that that's not true. And we have a court case which is less than 3 weeks old from Canada, where the Papal bulls and the Catholic Church stood behind that doctrine of discovery. So we have a lot of documentation, and nice thing about the digital world is we can we get a timestamp when we record these guys, and they can't lie. And then when we put it out, to public, and unfortunately, every time I post anything like that on Facebook or Instagram, I get put into jail again, and then it gets taken down. But I don't care. I'll just keep pushing it. And I told Tyler, I said, one of the couple week here, we were just talking the other day, and I said, well, we still have a lot more people to piss off in this world. So we just keep going. But Dr. Steeves, thank you many Yahwehs for all your things that you're doing, and your book is very interesting.
Thank you.
That's why we appreciate Yuri's work, because it's archaeological as well as geological.
Yes.
So the multidisciplinary approach adds further weight.
I mentioned
to
that Sam is a Seneca elder and did a wonderful 2-hour presentation with us just previously a few weeks back. So you're going to want to check that out as well on YouTube. And you mentioned Yuri, and Yuri is here. Yuri, can you jump on and share with us? Yuri had a fantastic presentation with us as well, just 3 or 4 weeks ago. So let me see if we can see if he's here. I'm kind of
and also we have
hands going up. Let me see.
Alan Day is here, a few others.
Okay. Yeah.
Good day to all of you. I'm in the Czech Republic, and I'm sorry because of my voice, as after having spent 1 week with my students in a field trip. So it's a little bit embarrassing, but anyhow, with very much interest, I listened to the presentation, and I think we are all, I guess, on one ship, because as I understand, we are fighting this very traditional and still persistent model, or this misconception, perhaps it's not a model in modern terms, about colonization of the American continent. And after our research in Alberta, which was initiated, yes, exactly 30 years ago, I assumed that the situation has changed, and the American colleagues, in the light of the scientific progress, became more open-minded, but I'm afraid it's not the case. And I simply cannot understand why this is so. I mean, I heard religions, I mean the modern religion, Bible, etc. But still, I mean, this would be a fraction of professionals. Yeah. I think that the fundamental problem is in education, in university education. And I don't want simply to repeat my double background, or 2 or 3 PhD degrees, anthropology, quaternary in geology, and archaeology. But this gives me and other people with a more broader perspective quite a deal of advantage. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think this is one of the way to follow. I mean, but I'm not analytical fellow. I'm really a field guy. Yeah. And as far as the gene flows and all these high-tech associated aspects of science, I think there is definitely a good deal of potential. And the more, I mean, when we are talking about hard science, the people should be strictly open-minded. I mean, there should not be any bias, political or financial, whatever. I mean, who gives the money? I mean, I should sing his or her song.
Right,
I mean,
right.
Yeah,
it used
thank
to
you.
be the case perhaps 50, 100 years ago, but I mean, we are living in a modern society. So,
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So Paulette, do you agree the problem is education?
Well, let me give you an example. So I've done some really big surveys and research projects in the last few years. And one of them was I researched all of the archaeological programs in Canada, United States, at least 4 major universities from every state and smaller colleges, and some from around the world. So in the Americas and in Canada, when you get a degree, a bachelor's degree in archaeology, that is your license to go out and become an archaeological field tech for a cultural resource management firm.
Okay.
So in every single program that I reviewed, not one program had a required course in Indigenous history of the Americas to get your BA, to get your license, to go dig up the history of the Americas. If you went to Greece without a ton of classes in the history of Greece and thought you were going to excavate, you'd be immediately sent home. I've seen that happen to students, right? In a lot of countries in the world, you must have courses on the history, you know, historic and prehistoric of that country to become an archaeologist in that country, but not in the Americas. So I worked in archaeological fieldwork in North America 5 years straight. I couldn't get a day off. And like I say, I was fired off the last 3 because I refused to lie about sites being there. But I got to meet a lot of field archaeologists. I met one who willingly took a non-elective course on Indigenous history because he was curious. I worked with a few hundred archaeologists. Not one of them had a course on Indigenous histories of the Americas. But here they were digging it up.
Mhm.
And there was so much abuse in the field. I think that there's been a change happening since then. And so that was before 2008. That was from 2003 to 2008.
Okay.
I think there is some change, but when people brought it up, how hypocritical that cultural resource management was because the people that pay them are the people that want the land cleared. That was a really violent conversation in the Americas. A lot of people were severely trounced, and all they were doing was stating the obvious. So we are not yet in a place. Oh my God, if I was going to be in a department of archaeology, by the way, I work in as a faculty for geography, geology, and land stewardship, and sociology and anthropology. We do not have an archaeology program at Algoma University. I keep applying when those come up at big universities, knowing they're never going to hire me, but I want to document it. So I go through the
I see.
painful experiences. And believe me, the last one, I was in shock for months after the last one. They were so rude to me. And so I have archaeology departments asking me to apply so they can check off their list. Oh, we had an Indigenous person. Yeah, no, they're not good enough. Right.
Yeah.
And so the Indigenous
controversial.
archaeologists that do get those jobs are staying within safe parameters of what they should be saying,
Mhm.
right? They're supporting archaeology. We need to get to a place where you can speak honestly about anything, right? That's how you begin pyroepistemology, how you begin to clean out those spaces
Mhm.
where it's safe to discuss anything, because that's our job.
Yes.
That needs to be
We've had
part-
researchers who say that the Wikipedia entry for them has totally trashed them just because they're in a area of research
Of
that is
controversy.
controversial, or somebody, the threshold guardian of Wikipedia, is saying, nope, only this, not that. So we've heard it as well in terms of just getting
And
out
we
there
need
to
to
the
teach
public.
about that. And so I
Yeah.
think it was 4 or 5 years where people kept trying to put up Wikipedia pages for me. They kept getting
Yeah.
attacked and taken down.
Yeah.
Finally, somebody who was an expert in it went in there and did it. And so far it's fine.
Mhm.
But yeah, there's still a lot of active aggression against Indigenous
The
scholars.
diversity not only of, but
Right.
of ideas.
Right.
Right,
Right.
and against in settler scholars, non-Indigenous scholars, even scholars from Europe who support that
Yeah.
people have been here longer.
Right.
That's not science.
Right.
Yeah.
It's really, it's, I hope we're getting past that, but you have to realistically, you have to teach about this. So the first thing I teach in my courses is about colonization. How can you learn to decolonize if you
Mhm.
don't know what colonization is? And you have to realize students haven't been taught about the bad deeds of their
Right.
own countries. People only recently were taught about residential schools in Canada. I have over 900 residential schools from
Yeah.
1620 to today on a database online,
And
right?
the atrocities that were happening there.
Right.
decades
People
ago.
had no clue. We're still reeling from those atrocities, and you're just beginning to hear about them.
Yeah.
Holy. So,
Yeah.
that's the kind of space we're still in, but I really appreciate people like Jiri and, other archaeologists, people like Mike Gamerly and others who have fearlessly published the truths that they have found. Like I
Yes.
said,
Yeah.
without them, I wouldn't have had anything to go on,
Yeah.
nothing. And
Well,
what I'm
thank you,
finding
Yuri.
now
Yeah.
is
So-
just, what I'm finding now is beyond my wildest dreams. The thousands of sites, I'm just like, wow, seriously? I thought I'd get my book
It's
down.
hard to deny the cumulative evidence, right? People
Well, I
say,
thought-
oh, show me
yeah.
more evidence for this story. Look at the cumulative evidence when it can come to light.
Right.
But
Thank
I
you
thought
so
I
much,
found this
Yuri.
great,
Yeah, you're right. Go ahead.
this great piece of evidence and I was done. But no, creator said, no, wait a minute, look at all these sites. So it's not just that, what's in my book now, it's like 4 or 5 times that. And
Mhm.
I need to keep talking, I guess, and writing.
We're talking about artifacts that survive because they were made of hard materials, bone and stone and antlers and such. But think about all the soft materials that
Mm.
didn't last through the ages, or the fossils that were dissolved by the acid in the soils, or
Mhm.
haven't been found yet, or is under the sea, or what have you. I mean, I'm really curious, I have to ask this. The Clovis culture. I can understand how, with a landscape of not knowing back when Clovis points were first discovered, oh, look at this evidence. What can we make of it? Oh, it's here, it's here, it's all over the place. But tell me about, we never see artifacts. That was James Harrod. That was our first discussion with James Harrod on this, is where's the art? Where's the rest of the culture? It's not, you can't just make a culture from a single point,
Yeah.
an arrowhead, spear point. Where's the rest of it?
Right.
So you were mentioning that Clovis was fictional. Can you just really put it into context for us?
Well,
Where
a cultural group includes language, music, clothing, spirituality, food, hunting practices, everything,
Yeah.
right? That's
Yeah.
a cultural group. When you have similarities in all of this and you all practice them, that's a cultural group. There was no such thing for Clovis. I
Mhm.
went in the museum at the University of Amherst in University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and I was looking at different books for my class I was teaching that I could recommend for students, and they had cultural books on the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and then the Clovis. Well, I just went through the roof. I just about fell through the floor, and I had to go to the librarian and say, excuse me, this is not a cultural group. This is an archaeological tool. But it had been granted a number as a cultural group in the Dewey Decimal System of the United States federal system. Oh my God, somebody fix this. That's how deeply embedded and it's incorrect. That's how deeply embedded it is. So we do need a lot of changes. And this is where anybody can help. If you ever go in a library and find a book on the Clovis people in a cultural section, immediately bring it to your library's attention that, oh, excuse me, this is not a cultural group. So what we need to do now is, and this is some of the work I'm starting, is how do we define possible regional areas and possible related groups? Well, we look at the stone tools. There isn't a name or a typology for stone tools. You know, there's fishtail points, there's this point. We need to look at all the stone tools found at all of these sites that are older than Clovis. We
Right.
need to collectively come together, everybody who can, and we need to discuss how can we organize and name these tools from 2 continents to start giving them a life. How can we look at paleobotany to understand, were these people eating the same as those people over there? You
Mhm.
know, were they
Cultural
their
distinction.
food the
Mhm.
same? We need to look at, you know, paleobotany. We need to look at everything we can find, you know, at sites, biomarkers in the soil. to
So when a
show-
Clovis point is found, why aren't they finding some of the other cultural attributes? Because they don't last necessarily. I mean, I find it interesting that in the Amazon, they're now recognizing this was highly populated and sophisticated by the mere fact that you've got plants that were brought in groups to provide the materials, the clothing, the structure, the tools, the foodstuffs. This is an artifact, the
Yeah,
forest
yeah.
itself, the 8 feet of beautiful soil layered with pottery and biochar and compost. This is constructed. These are artifacts. We have to widen also the spectrum of what we define as artifacts as well. Not everybody was building stone buildings that we can still see, but they left their mark on the landscape if we truly understand what a culture and its legacy was, right?
Right, right.
So that takes a lot of funding. It takes a lot of people. So Monteverde in Chile is a very good example of a site where they've done all of that.
Yeah.
An amazing group of archaeologists and geologists have documented the beds of terra preta soil across the Amazon that supported huge civilizations. I've
That
recreated
take
it.
millennia to compose as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it regenerates itself. And so that's what I'm doing here in the north. I have 30 raised beds I recreated from that knowledge on terra preta soil, and it's doing very well. My plants are very
Wow.
happy. I give away hundreds of pounds of food a year from
Wow.
a small urban yard. But yeah, there's a lot of different pieces of evidence we should be considering at every site. You know, paleobotany is extremely important.
And our
This-
agricultural systems today could use an overhaul as well for
Yeah.
sustainability and ecology. Look to what the ancient people did. They were successful at this. Why can't we do the same today? Right?
Oh, there's 2 more people that have their hands up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
let's go.
okay, well, let's go to Alan Day. There he is. Hello, Alan.
Yeah, greetings and sanitations. I just wanted to interject here that since there's been some mention of Mike Gramley and James Herod, their co-authored article on Pleistocene sled burials in Eastern North America has been published in the eminent journal Anthropologie, and it is available on researchgate.net, and I would highly recommend reading it.
Yes.
I'm quite eager to hear what the archaeological establishment has to say about it once they actually become aware of it, which of course may take a while. That's all I had. Carry on.
Thank you. And
Yeah,
you can find Gramley's and James Harrods's YouTube with
us as well.
with
Yeah,
us.
that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Well,
Appreciate that.
Thank you.
And as they pointed out, they're getting into these respected journals with this.
Oh, yeah. And Alan, did you finish what you were going to say? You seem like your hand is still up.
Yeah, that's all I had to say. I'm quite interested in listening at this point. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Alan.
Okay. Oh, Tony, did you want to interject something quickly? I see your hand is up again.
Yeah, totally quickly. First of all, I love that it's getting into the journals. That's a great thing. So I want to say that I have just ordered a copy of your book, Paulette. And but one question I have about the Indigenous history, it gets to be kind of hard sometimes. One area where I've worked extensively is Chaco Canyon, there are 27 nations that claim an origin from there, and none of the stories are the same. So it's a very difficult thing to navigate. And I wonder if you can comment on that, how to do that. No matter what you say, you're probably going to offend 26 nations.
Yeah. One thing you got to make sure is that you have something to say from each of those 27 nations. And so that's, you know, it is a difficult piece of the work, but it's a part of holistic work to include Indigenous voices. And some areas like the Southwest are incredibly diverse, the Southwestern California. And so it's very time consuming. It's a lot of work. But look at Keith Basso's work. You know, he went out there and lived with people for a couple of years, right? Wisdom sits in places. And so we just, you know, we're not taught that in graduate school. We're not taught that growing up. We need to listen just as much as we talk and think.
Oh,
And we need to
Thank you.
practice doing that. It's not in our nature because we're taught to, you know, find a question, find the answer, find the evidence. But in between all of those findings is listening. And sometimes people aren't ready to share. Thankfully, in the Southwest, a lot of those communities have actually put their stories online on videos, which is great. But giving each community the respect of having the opportunity to be a part of or to inform, you know, whatever it is you're doing, that's really important.
thank you, Tony.
Yeah.
Well, one, if I could mention one flash problem has been the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I've just come from a meeting of the American Astronomical Society, and a few changes. The director of the 30-meter telescope has now moved to Hawaii, and they're bringing Indigenous people on the board as voting members, not just as advisors.
Oh,
That's good.
And so we may begin to see some things happening differently. At least everybody appreciated that at the society, including a large number of Indigenous astronomers present. So I thought I would mention that. Maybe there's some good news.
That is good news, Tony.
thank you, Tony, for
Yeah.
that report.
Ian,
I think we have one last,
let me see. Ian had his.
Oh.
hand up
hello,
again.
Ian.
Hi, thank you. I had my device powered down on me, so I missed a bit of the dialogue, but thanks for including me. I don't know if you saw my comment, but I'm a summer intern in horticulture at Plymouth Patuxent Museums in Massachusetts,
Yes.
on this
Okay.
Plymouth Plantation, which is a museum that is a living history museum and portrays a 17th century English village where the actors are acting as if they're in the year 1627. And then I work on the Wampanoag or historic Patuxent home site, as we call it, because Patuxent was a community of Wampanoag people prior to the English ever arriving
Oh,
here. So I just wanted to comment when you said about artifacts that are of other material. The museum holds a clay pot made by a Manomet Wampanoag woman, possibly around 400 years ago. And the museum used to have a placard next to it, which gave, you know, credit to the pot hunter who found it.
Oh.
And now it's, you know, labeled a bit more genuine, you know, a bit more accurately. However, the museum is committed. Well, the central question that we're sort of addressing this summer is what it means to decolonize as an institution. However, I've felt that this progress is pretty slow. So yeah, and also just get to my question. As a staff member on home site, I get a lot of guest and audience interaction. And so I get to speak on horticulture, traditional horticulture of Wampanoag people, which is, you know, corn, beans, and squash, Jerusalem artichokes, watermelon. I've been learning, I guess, a small, you know, sort of indigenous watermelon. And anyway, it's kind of a privilege to be able to, I guess, interact with guests, but I guess I wanted to ask for a little advice on, you know, how to kind of set the record straight. As you said, people often repeat what they've been taught, and it can be hard to really break the understanding of, you know, oh, some Native American peoples were not like having a rich, you know, like they were, especially in this region, the coast and the land provides a lot, especially back then. So just trying to, you know, make the point that they weren't struggling a rich seasonal culinary, you know, diet. And so I just wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on that, I suppose.
Thank
and
you.
how to
Ian.
sort of, yeah, and how to present or speak on artifacts such as that clay pot, which is, you know, has been on display for 40 years and probably needs a little rest. But sorry to be so long-winded.
No.
Yeah, well, one of the things you can do is everything you say, everything you teach people becomes a counter narrative to dehumanizing stereotypes. And so being aware of those dehumanizing stereotypes, like you said, it's not just what is said about us, it's more what is not said about us. So there was a textbook I had to use as a graduate student because I had to help a professor teach a class. That was part of the graduate program, right? This textbook stated an artifact could be a beautiful 20,000-year-old spear point from France, or it could be an indistinguishable flake some weary Indian chucked out in a Mississippi cornfield 1,000 years ago. This was 2009, right?
Oh my God.
Why would that be acceptable to say an indistinguishable flake that some weary Indian chucked out? Like, oh my God, when I brought it up to the professor, he was pissed. He went through the roof. He took him years, but he eventually came around and realized I was right. That's very egregious, you know, but here's a graduate student having to tell a professor, your book is racist, the book you're using. And so you have to keep that in mind. This is what people are still being taught. And so everything you say can be a really strong counter narrative to those negative stereotypes. Of course, they had a rich and diverse culture. Look at the landscape. You know, all the 6 coastal tribes there, they still hold all their oral traditions about those islands, Martha's Vineyard, you know, the footprints of the giants. That's all there. That hasn't been lost. And look what they did with the Wampanoag. Oh my God. You have a very, very rich history to draw from. So I would use that to completely overwhelm people with the richness and the beauty of their life.
That's well said.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Interesting work that you're doing.
Yeah,
Ian.
Ian. Good work, Ian, and good for
Yeah.
following through. Yeah.
So I guess cancel culture has been alive and well for hundreds of years. Your comment on that and how you see it in operation today, Paulette.
Yeah, we have to continually push back on negative stereotypes. And we have to remember that people believe the scientists. They believe the archaeologists because they're taught that these are smart people who earned a degree. They're scientists. Yeah, here's a group of scientists that created a myth based on the impossible, based on hypothesis and ideas, not on scientific facts. That's been stated as a scientific fact for over 100 years in the Americas, that we came across the land bridge 10 or 12,000 years ago. Yeah, we came across the land bridge probably dozens and hundreds of times over the last 100,000 years, right? Hello, right? So people need to be taught, you know, number one, what they have been taught is not based on science, right? It's based on racism and conjecture and a history of racism in colonial academia. You know, that's a no-brainer. We know that was there. And number two, well, then what are the facts? Well, learn to think critically and look.
And ask
Because
questions.
for me, this was like taking candy from a baby. This evidence wasn't hiding. You know, the history of mammals and coming and going that's been so incredibly well documented, that was never hidden. All of these archaeological sites that have been published, that was never hidden. All it did was it took me time, and it took a lot of effort to make sure that nobody could violently critique my book. Every single line or second line was cited. Everything was double, triple, quadruple checked for the dates, the facts, you know, and I probably still made a few mistakes, but I was extremely careful to only pick sites that were really strong. Look out in my next book, you're going to have all kinds of sites, because what we want is for people going forward to understand these are all possibilities, and for students going forward to understand these are all opportunities to unearth the true history of the Americas and to support Indigenous people.
I want to point out, though, it's not only ancient and very early sites that are being denied in the Americas. I know that the general feeling is that, oh, humans, at least those who left a mark in Europe, arrived maybe 40, 50,000 years ago. But then I was reading, we were looking at an artifact from Crete, and then looking at a cave, and then looking at an interesting report from some archaeologists. Oh, it looks like people came by boat to Crete 130,000 years ago. And you go, oh, 130, that's an interesting date. Well, why not? Right? It's not that hard to create a boat that's worthy, especially hugging a coast. You know, can we just credit our early ancestors with all of their accomplishments? At least ask the questions, at least look at the data, at least put the data on the table so we can see how it's accumulating and what we can read from all of the trends there. So it's just exciting. Something hidden that we get to unearth immediately. It's exciting. So yeah, I just want to say that there's a lot more going on that meets the eye, but the most egregious thing, and I really appreciate all the progress that has been made in the decade, that the Indigenous elders and scholars are getting a voice at the table, that we're acknowledging all of this. The grassroots has always embraced this, in my experience. The grassroots has been ready to say, well, of course, why not?
Yeah.
So I appreciate that you wrote your book for the general audience as well as the
Yes.
scholars. And yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
and Lynn had a final comment before we end today. Lynn, did you want to add?
Yes. You mentioned that they found mitochondria letter M, and yet the gatekeepers tell us that only A, B, C, and D are women of American descent. Do you know?
It was actually the male haplotype M.
Oh, it was
Not the mitochondria.
male.
Yeah.
Okay.
And those
Because-
papers are those articles are out there if you just search for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm
But they
still
never
curious.
did discuss it.
Okay. I'm still
on the
curious
initial.
about the gatekeeping for letter A, B, C, D, that women who are Native American can only descend from that. Because
Yeah,
we've
that's
seen-
based on less than 1/5 of 1% of the data. So you just got to say they can't be making those kinds of claims because they
Right.
don't have the data.
Do you know your own haplotype?
No,
Okay.
I know I'm Indigenous. I know where my people are from on the land. I don't need a genetic marker to know.
Yeah, beautifully said.
Thank you. And this brings up a question. How
Thank you, Lynn.
many, when you look at all the genetic data thus far, because more will come in and the picture will change, but how many genetic threads, how many migrations from where do you think is involved in this tapestry from the
This
American?
I don't think anybody
Listen.
knows, and nobody at the moment has the data to know.
Okay.
Right.
What we just need to do is to be open-minded and create safe spaces to do that work.
Yeah.
You know,
Thank
and
you.
to listen to Indigenous people. But if you just even look at the linguistics, the diversity is absolutely incredible on these two continents. And, you know, we need to be open-minded to all of this because, you know, like you've mentioned earlier, we were just simple. There weren't very many of us. We weren't that civilized. You know, it wasn't very densely populated. Yet other people have published papers that show that there were over 8 million people just in one area of the Americas at a given time. The little ice age in Europe, do you know what caused that? No, nobody knows. There's a most amazing paper, and I'm going to send it to you. These 5 settler archaeologists and geologists did this. But when invaders first came to the Americas, Indigenous people had been practicing a lot of slash and burn. So you burn the forest and then you plant and you grow. That was one of their ways. That there were so many people doing that created a certain amount of carbon and heat in the atmosphere. When the
Winds
invaders
blow it
came
over.
over and killed a lot of people, or disease killed a lot of people, so many millions of people died, there was a huge carbon sink, and that's what caused the little ice age in Europe, was the death of all the indigenous people in the Americas. I thought it was brilliant because these guys weren't saying that, they were actually showing it using hard science, hard data. And I'm like, wow, why is nobody talking about that, right? That's pretty amazing work.
Wow.
Go
And last question, what do you think happened to the camelids, the mastodons, the saber-tooth, all that huge flora and fauna prior to, where did it all go? Why
Well,
don't we have
the earth changes. You can look on a global scale, and whether it's, an asteroid hit or whether it's a phenomenal weather event, the earth doesn't stay static.
Right.
It's
Well, we know that.
always changed across time. Why should we expect it to stay static?
Well,
When you
said Africa's major flora, rhinos and all that stayed, but ours didn't. I'm sad about that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, well, I don't think all of theirs did either. But you need to look at what was their food. When things start dying out, it's because their food basis disappears, right? And interestingly enough, of the 28 species that went extinct, there's only evidence of 2 of them ever being used by humans. So you can't pin this on humans.
okay, that was my
Environmental, right? And that's what we need to look at. Other people looking to trash, Native Americans jumped all over this to create this hateful, dehumanizing rhetoric that we were slaughtering everything and just leaving it to die. And we killed all, no, we didn't. There were only 2 species.
your practice is for sustainability. So
Yeah.
The practice, yeah.
Last words, and thank you so much for joining us and your
Maybe-
slideshow and all the work that you're doing. But any last comments to leave
Do you
us
have your
with?
book next to you? You can hold up your book.
Oh, do I have my book? Usually I have it. Yeah, here's my book right here. So I don't know if you can.
Come close to the
Closer.
screen and see what happens. Oh, it
Yeah,
doesn't
it's
work
gonna
with the
be
background.
backwards. Well, you all know what it is, the Indigenous Paleolithic of the Western Hemisphere. Please share with your families, with libraries, with communities, so that everybody can have an opportunity to become more informed. And this is how we make change in the world, is by spreading knowledge, and it's knowledge coming from an Indigenous base to everybody in the world, looking to create peace, healing, and reconciliation. So
To hear
thank
all of
you
our
for
voices.
being here. Thank you all for having me today and for being here.
And
Thank you,
yeah,
Dr. Paulette
thank you.
Steeves.
Thank you